Okay, so we are broadcasting.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for tuning in for the kickoff of CalCCA's Community Energy Innovation webinar series. I'm Leora Vestal, CalCCA's Director of Communications. Also here as part of the webinar team is Sandra McCafferty, CalCCA Administrative Coordinator. We're excited to bring you today's webisode about an innovative cutting-edge renewable energy microgrid project. But first, a few words about our webinar sponsor, Calpine Energy Solutions. Calpine partners with community choice energy programs throughout California, providing customer and data management, call center, risk reporting, and other key services. An early supporter of CCA in California, Calpine now counts 17 aggregators as clients, including the state's newest CCAs, Desert Community Energy, and Western Community Energy, which initiated service just this month. The company's sponsorship funding will go directly to charities around the state that are providing relief to those most impacted by the coronavirus pandemic. Leading today's webinar will be Matthew Marshall, Executive Director of the Redwood Coast Energy Authority, and Jim Zolik, Managing Research Engineer at the Schatz Energy Research Center at Humboldt State University. Redwood Coast CCA program launched in 2017 and now serves about 62,000 customer accounts in Humboldt County. A key area of focus for the Schatz Center, a leading research institution, is the design, demonstration, and deployment of renewable energy technologies. Today's webinar is being recorded and all participants will be in listen-only mode. Please use the Q&A button on your screen to type in questions. A Q&A with our speakers will follow the presentation. Matthew, take it away.
Thanks for the introduction. And, yeah, I'm Matthew Marshall, and just a brief intro on the Redwood Coast Energy Authority. We've been around as a local government joint powers agency focused on energy initiatives since 2003. And then we launched our community choice program. We're coming up on the 3-year anniversary in a week. So we launched back in 2017. So that's an exciting milestone for us, and first 3 years have been good. And then, throughout our history, we've had very close partnership with the Schatz Energy Research Center at Humboldt State University. So this is kind of the latest and newest project that we're collaborating on together. Next slide. So, we're interested in microgrids up in Humboldt County, particularly as a rural, pretty isolated community that's at the end of kind of, a couple transmission lines that come into the county, and that import-export capability is fairly limited, and so we're very much dependent on local generation. And as a rural area, we're vulnerable to tsunamis, earthquakes, floods, wildfires, and in association with wildfires, public safety power shutoff events. We had 2 shutoff events last year, and I think that really highlighted sort of the vulnerability we have to losing power in our area. And so we're very interested in using microgrids as a way to achieve environmental goals as well as our energy resilience goals. Next slide. So this project at the Humboldt County Airport, has a range of objectives that I think, microgrids can kind of align a lot of exciting interests. We want to first, demonstrate sort of a viable model for a community scale microgrid, and we'll talk a little bit more about what we mean by community scale. And providing, the resilience to critical community services that entails, and for us that really, it's the Coast Guard Air Station is co-located with our county airport. And so, both the airport and the Coast Guard are sort of critical pieces of our emergency response capabilities. And in the event of a natural disaster, that's at the heart of the ability to kind of meet the needs of our community. And so, the other part of that is, we've got our renewable energy goals and our, particularly our local renewable energy development goals as far as keeping dollars in the community, creating local jobs through energy projects, and providing affordable renewable energy to our customers. And so microgrids, kind of create a nexus between resilience and those environmental and economic goals that can help support our greenhouse gas climate action objectives. And as part of this project, it's a grant-funded demonstration project. We really want to kind of figure out the processes and ways to kind of have this truly be something that can be replicated, at other sites around the state, and also really kind of to sort of help align the technology development with the sort of needed policy and tariff structures to be able to make this something that can be deployed at scale around the state. Next slide. So the project team and project partners, overall the project is funded by a grant from the California Energy Commission, as well as about the other half of the funding is coming from the Redwood Coast Energy Authority and our CCA program. And there's also EPIC funding through PG&E that's supporting some of the technological development. The Schatz Energy Research Center is the lead on the overall project and helping design and engineer and manage the installation. We're working very closely with PG&E, who is the owner and operator of the distribution system that is actually integrated into the microgrid, and we'll get into those technical details. But it's a very close partnership with PG&E, and then us as the generation owner and operator. As the CCA, we'll be actually owning and operating the generation. Then the County of Humboldt is, the owner and operator of the airport site that's hosting the project. And then we have a number of key vendors that are providing, the technical expertise and the technology to deploy the project, which includes Tesla, Schweitzer Engineering Labs, TRC, the Energy Authority, that are kind of helping us work out both the sort of program and logistical elements of it, as well as the technical elements. Next slide. So, I think some of the elements that are somewhat innovative about this project, one is that it's a partnership between an investor and utility and a CCA. And we're really working kind of in partnership with PG&E on this, where we're owning and operating the generation elements of the microgrid, while they're owning and continue to operate the distribution components of it as a multi-customer microgrid with a wholesale generation system providing the power in island mode. And so that's something somewhat unique. And that's really built on a pretty long working relationship with PG&E on a lot of projects over the years, and particularly on California Energy Commission supported projects. We've often worked with PG&E, the Schatz Center, on these kinds of efforts. And kudos to having a world-class research center in our backyard. That's really enabled us as a small rural CCA to, I think, take on these kinds of projects that we probably wouldn't be able to just move forward as effectively without that ongoing relationship with them. And then, to the point of this being really a demonstration project, working with the California Energy Commission, the CPUC and CAISO on kind of using this as a way to sort of work out lessons learned for multi-customer microgrids and support kind of broader distributed energy research integration across the state, and use this as kind of a testing ground for some of these concepts. Next slide. So as far as the project itself, on the right there is kind of a artist rendering of the solar and storage and control system layout, adjacent to the airport, which is up in the up and left-hand corner of that picture. And so, in PG&E's territory, this will be actually the first sort of front-of-the-meter multi-customer microgrid on their system. And so the components of it are a 2.2 megawatt PV array DC coupled with a similar sized battery storage system. And that'll be on, again, the wholesale side of the meter. It'll just be under normal blue sky conditions, will be a part of our portfolio, and we'll operate it and, feed the power into the CAISO market, and use it to help, achieve our power resources goals on a day-to-day basis. There's also a smaller 320 kW net metered system that's behind the meter for the airport and offsetting their loads. It looks like one big array in that, but there's actually kind of an invisible line where electrically part of it's feeding the airport, and then the majority of it though is on the wholesale side. And then there's the control systems that'll allow us to island when the grid goes down, to provide islanding to the customers that are on this branch of PG&E's distribution system. And so next slide. So if you look at a layout of the airport, the yellow lines on this, other than the highway on the left, are the distribution grid system in the area. And so, that little blue marker there is by the corner of where the battery system and the interconnection point is to the main distribution grid. And so that's where we'll be connecting to the PG&E grid. And then basically all the customers within that dotted line on those branches of the distribution system will be able to be islanded and served by the wholesale and behind the meter solar arrays if the larger grid goes down. And there's about 20 retail accounts on that branch of the distribution system, including, like I said, the Coast Guard and the airport and tenants to the airport. There's 19 unbundled CCA customers. We're actually going to opt out an RCEA load to demonstrate what a non-CCA customer's kind of experience would be, and how that relates, to if the microgrid is going into island mode, how do we deal with the compensation for a customer that isn't a CCA customer when the CCA owned generation is providing service, and so that would be applicable if it was a direct access customer or bundle customers. Right now there were no unbundled customers, so we're going to opt out actually an RCEA meter to demonstrate kind of how that works on the billing side and the logistics of that component of the project. So that's the overall layout and kind of scope of the system. I'm going to hand it off to Jim to get into the technical details.
Thank you, Matthew, and thanks everybody for joining us today. So just to carry on a little bit with what Matthew described, the next couple slides, I'll go through some of the technical details, and then I'm going to talk about the innovation aspects of this project. So the microgrid that Matthew just described, the different components, there basically are two modes for a microgrid, and that's really what defines a microgrid is sort of DERs that have the ability to not only run in parallel with the grid, but also to run in island mode, to isolate themselves from the bulk grid and form a microgrid. So those are the two modes of operation. And in this innovative partnership between RCEA and PG&E, there is a division of ownership and responsibilities on this system. And I'll go through some of that in terms of the actual equipment. I mean, not piece by piece, but give you a sense of that, kind of the division there. So in grid connected mode, RCEA as a third party generator connected to PG&E's distribution system, they will have total control over their generation asset, as they should, and they'll be participating, as Matthew said, in the wholesale market. We're looking at both, the energy market as well as frequency regulation. And then in the event that the bulk grid goes down, basically, the microgrid will island itself, and the wholesale interconnection. Actually, I'm sorry, I'm down to the island mode. So that wholesale generator will then form the islanded grid, and PG&E in that case will actually have control over the generator and the islanded grid to make sure that their customers are served safely and power quality requirements are met and so forth. And RCEA as the owner of that generator will be compensated for services they provide. The one other point that I jumped over, the wholesale interconnection, we are constraining, so Matthew described what the capacities were of the wholesale system, basically 2.2 megawatts of PV, 2.2 megawatts and 8.8 megawatt hours of battery storage. We are constraining the export to 1,778 kilowatts and the maximum import for charging of the battery to 1,480 kilowatts. And we've just chosen to do that to basically mitigate system upgrades that otherwise would have been necessary to support the full capacity and would have added cost to the project that was not sustainable in terms of the way the project is being financed and funded. So that's just a kind of a particular detail. On to the next slide, please. So this is a simple single line electrical diagram of the system, and I'll go through just the basics here. So there are 3 different colored boxes that you see on the screen, kind of from your left to your right. There's green boxes, there's blue boxes, and there are orange boxes. The green is new facilities that are being added to the circuit. You can see that's at the top, the PG&E Janes Creek 1103 circuit that Matthew showed there on that map. So the green boxes are control equipment or facilities that are being added to the system. The blue boxes are power facilities that are being added to the system, basically generators and storage. And the orange boxes are existing power related facilities, but those are basically the customer loads. And so you see the airport main service, the US Coast Guard air station, and then a number of additional accounts all being served off of those transformers. And then you also see the green recloser and circuit breaker. So if I start up in the upper left-hand corner with the recloser, that is an automated switch that's being installed. And that will basically, as I mentioned a minute ago, when the main grid, bulk grid goes down, that recloser will open and will isolate the microgrid. And then the generation on the microgrid will form an island and support the loads on the microgrid. You can see there's a microgrid controller there that has control over the recloser. It also has control of the circuit breakers that are shown. Those are SCADA controlled circuit breakers, basically automated controlled circuit breakers. There's also control from that microgrid controller of the generation and the EV charging. That microgrid controller is actually multiple controllers. There are actually 2 controllers, and that was a design decision that was figured out early on in the project. And the reason we did that is to separate, and I'll talk more about this in a few minutes, but to separate between the IOU, the distribution system operator, in this case PG&E, and the CCA, in this case our CEA, the control and responsibilities, what we call the operational roles and responsibilities. So there's a line between what our CEA is responsible for and what PG&E is responsible for. And it's delineated in software, but we chose to actually split the microgrid controller into 2 hardware devices that each entity owns their own device, has control and has responsibility for that device. If anything needs to change, that's their prerogative. Obviously, they need to coordinate and work together, but rather than putting it all on one controller, we split that into 2. You can also see that the PG&E Distribution Control Center is connected to that controller, to PG&E's controller, and that's a novel piece of the project that I'll talk a little bit more about in a minute. And then you can see the net metered array and the battery storage with the DC coupled PV array, and some EV charging that will be demand response capable. The 2 circuit breakers you can see can also be controlled. So if needed, those circuit breakers can disconnect those the generation and storage assets. Next slide, please. So the rest of these slides, what I want to do is really just talk about some of the different innovative aspects to this project, and I've sort of categorized them into a few different groups. So the first one has to do with the business model and really demonstrating a replicable business model. So this project, as Matthew mentioned, is in part being funded by the California Energy Commission through the EPIC program. It was their second microgrid solicitation. And for anybody who remembers that solicitation and sort of the objective of it, one of the very main objectives was to demonstrate a replicable business model. They wanted not only advances in technology and regulatory and so forth, but something that what wouldn't be done just once with grant funding, but could be replicated and supported from a business standpoint. And so the Venn diagram to the right on that slide lays out what we presented as and what we think is a replicable business model. The Venn diagram is really three trends that we see happening that intersect and give rise to this opportunity for a replicable business model. And so those three trends are, first of all, there's many CCAs in California. The projections are that at some point, maybe 80% of the load in California will be met by CCAs. And CCAs in California in particular, most of them, if not all of them, have strong goals and objectives for renewables and for resilience and for supporting their local communities. And so they have strong goals for developing local renewable resources to serve their customers' needs. And that's very much one of our CEA's strong goals and objectives, and it's very well supported by the local community. In addition to that, the IOUs, in this case PG&E, are working to transition to the sustainable smart grid of the future. That includes smart meters, that includes more digitization, it includes them upgrading their distribution control centers and so forth. And then at the same time, there's climate change occurring and this really very clear need for additional resilience. And this project started before the PSPS events started happening. So, and resilience was already a big issue in terms of bigger storms. And in our area, we have, major earthquake opportunity, tsunami opportunity, et cetera. Now we have the wildfires, and on top of the wildfires, we have the PSPS events. So, resilience is really a key issue. So if you put all these together, if CCAs are looking to develop local generation and storage, if they can, and especially if they can locate that close to critical facilities, and then add the ability through controls and protection to be able to island, and it may require some upgrades of the distribution system. It certainly requires working with the utility, especially if we're talking about a front of the meter multi-customer facility. But if you're able to do that, there's some marginal added cost, but there's also some great gains in terms of resilience. And so that's the replicable model that we're looking to demonstrate. Next slide, please. So that model gives rise to a very unique ownership structure and situation. And basically that is that, here we have a CCA and an IOU partnering on this and sharing ownership and sharing responsibilities. And I think that's a very unique situation. So as Matthew said, the first front of the meter multi-customer microgrid on PG&E's territory. And it basically, we're working very hard and PG&E has been a really strong partner. As Matthew mentioned, they have some of their own EPIC 3.11 funding that's really enabled them to really, they have a team assigned to this project and we have weekly interaction with them. They're very committed to this project, and that's very important because there's a lot to accomplish here in terms of the roles and responsibilities and making sure that what we implement here is safe, is reliable, it meets. So basically, since this front of the meter microgrid is on PG&E's system, they're still responsible, even in island mode, for serving those distribution customers. And so as opposed to a behind the meter microgrid where once it islands, it's just a customer owned facility, certainly it still needs to be safe, it needs to meet all those sorts of needs, but it's completely the customer's ownership and responsibility and liability. In this case, it's front of the meter. And so we've been working on, agreements and tariffs and processes and standards and requirements to make sure that this system is done in a safe and functional way. And we're hoping that we're laying some of the groundwork so that it makes it much easier in the future for those that come behind us to replicate and do similar things. And we're not suggesting that what we're doing is the only way or necessarily even the best way, but we're doing our best to work with all of our project team members to come up with something that works for our CEA and PG&E and is safe and equitable. So I guess one of the key things with that is what we sort of refer to as a bright, clean line. And by a bright, clean line, I mean a distinction between what is owned and operated and who has responsibility for various aspects of the system. So this includes hardware, it includes software, and it includes operational tasks. And that's been the detail, getting into the details, kind of into the weeds of this, is figuring out who owns and operates what. And I already mentioned, that we split it into 2 hardware controllers for that reason. So the agreements that we're coming up with are trying to really lay out that bright, clean line, and we're trying to do it in a way that is, again, safe, functional, and equitable, and makes sense. And so, we will be sharing our lessons learned. We'll be doing that as part of the open CPUC microgrid proceeding. We're interested after webinars like this, if you have feedback, we're interested to hear it, certainly, and through any other public meetings, public engagement, we're interested to get feedback. But what we're committed to is doing something that works for our project. We're hoping it makes sense for others, perhaps, and can lead to replicability. But we want to ensure that we have a successful project here on the North Coast. Next slide, please. So this ownership model leads then to these tariffs and agreements. And so the 2 things I think that the tariffs and agreements really are aimed at doing is 1, defining the roles and responsibilities and codifying that into these agreements so that there is responsibility, ownership, liability, et cetera. And then there's also the cost and benefits associated with this microgrid. And so, we're trying to track those costs and benefits and make sure that there is an equitable distribution of those costs and benefits. We did sort of adopt a principle as a project team early on that in this effort to develop tariffs and agreements and make sure that there was an equitable distribution of costs and benefits, that we would try to avoid cost shifting between ratepayers. I realize that's a very big conversation, and it's not one that we're trying to answer. That involves a much, a big a group of stakeholders. But it is something that's specified in the legislation for the SB 1339 legislation for microgrids and is a part of the open proceeding. So basically we decided to adopt that for our project to be consistent with that open proceeding. And we think what we're doing is sensible, but it's, it's a bigger question that's open to conversation and debate probably. So these tariffs have to compensate this third-party generator. This is a very unique thing to have a third party that's able to form the utilities grid. So it's unique in terms of the responsibilities and so forth, as I've talked about the operational roles and responsibilities. But now you have a situation where the third party may be providing grid services when in island mode that the utility then has to compensate them for. And so that's something, and Matthew mentioned that one case with a bundled customer, but even with unbundled customers, there's non-energy services that the grid itself provides that now are being enabled by this third-party generator. So the agreements are trying to make sure that that compensation is accounted for and is done equitably. So at the bottom there, you see a set of documents. The first two, the controller interface requirements and the operational roles and responsibilities, have to do with the roles and responsibilities. And then the last two, the islanded grid, has to do with the compensating for those services when the grid is islanded to the third-party generator and grid forming generator. And then the last one, the microgrid infrastructure cost recovery, has to do with allocation of costs that are incurred when this microgrid is going in, what has to be upgraded on the distribution system. Next slide, please. So CAISO market participation is, is another aspect of the project, and I think another area of innovation. CAISO is also a party to the open proceeding along with the CPUC and the CEC. I'll say that this model that we're demonstrating for front of the meter multi-customer microgrids, that I think it's likely that, so for any microgrid, the generation asset and generation and storage asset really need to have strong benefits and whether it's revenue generation or cost mitigation, et cetera, during the majority of the time, during what we refer to as blue sky operation, normal grid connected mode, which is 99% of the time you're going to be grid connected. Obviously, the microgrid is also very important for resilience. That's why people do them when the grid goes down, but that's a very small portion of the time. So for front-of-the-meter microgrids, one of the main benefits or ways to generate revenue is through wholesale market participation. If you're front-of-the-meter microgrid, you're not behind the meter, you're not going to be able to get retail benefit through net metering. So we are working with CAISO to interconnect our system and become a market participant. There's a number of key innovations that we see happening. The first is CAISO has a hybrid resource initiative that's currently underway. We're participating in that initiative, and we will be one of the first hybrid resource market participants to be interconnected under that initiative. It's likely actually that we'll be interconnected probably before that resource initiative is finished, and then we'll sort of migrate into it, but we're working with CAISO closely on that. So for any microgrid that is participating in the CAISO market, for any microgrid period, there's a need to hold some energy storage capacity in your battery at all times as your insurance policy that provides you that resilience that you need if the grid should go down unexpectedly. If there's not any energy stored in your battery and it's nighttime, let's say, you're not going to be able to island. So you have to hold that some minimum amount of stored energy capacity, and how much that is depends on how much load you're trying to support and how long it needs to run for, et cetera. If you're participating in the CAISO market with energy storage, they actually require that you report the full capacity of your storage and that they have access to it should it be needed. Even if you don't bid the full capacity, they require that they have access to it. And so we're working with them closely on that and trying to make sure that we can hold some reserve capacity outside of the market processes to make sure that we always have that resilience, because otherwise we lose that benefit of the microgrid and it just doesn't work. So we think that's an important thing to work out through the proceeding and through our project, hopefully. And then finally is the question of what happens if you're connected to the CAISO grid and you're participating in their markets and you've got metering and market settlement processes that happen. What happens when you're in island mode? You're actually no longer connected to the CAISO grid. You are still serving customers, and the CAISO meters are still active. And so we're really kind of working through some of those details. We're in the sort of beginning stages, and that also affects the tariff agreements that we're developing between our CEI and PG&E. So very interesting things, and hopefully be some real strong lessons learned that can help with replication. Next slide, please. So I think I have a couple more here. So technical innovation, I think this is the last innovation slide. So DC coupled PV plus battery system, DC coupled systems, not real common at this point. Couple of advantages for that is that there are some potential efficiency gains because you're eliminating one set of inverters, so you don't have to go from the PV through an inverter and then through the battery inverter to charge the battery. You can just go straight from the PV to the battery. And then also it provides some benefits in terms of control of the PV system, in terms of smoothing the output and minimizing spikes that can come. So especially where we live, it's cloudy on the North Coast, and especially where the airport is, the weather can change very, very quickly. And so if it's cloudy and all of a sudden the cloud goes away and the sun pops out and you get a spike of power, that can cause problems. Certainly on an islanded grid, it can cause issues, and even on a non-islanded grid when we're interconnected, because we have those export constraint, that will actually trip the breaker and open, put us in island mode, which we don't want to do unless there's a good reason to. So by DC coupling the PV and battery, you're able to more easily smooth out the output, control the output from that coupled system, and make sure that there are any spikes that cause you problems. And then the control and monitoring of these distributed resources from PG&E's Distribution Control Center, that's a really important technical innovation. It goes well beyond microgrids, just for DERs in general. The more DERs we see on the system, the more larger scale community systems we see out there, the more important that's going to be to manage and balance the grid and provide, the right power quality and so forth. So that interaction, they'll be able to see and control these resources in this microgrid from their distribution control center. And then finally, it's a 100% renewable microgrid. It's solar and battery powered only. And the interconnecting inverter-based distributed generators on the grid create some issues with regard, certainly in island mode, with regard to protection settings and achieving adequate fault current. If there's a fault, to make sure that you can trip your breakers basically and have coordinated fault modes. So we're actually going to be using two different settings for the fault currents. One will be for grid connected mode, the other will be for island mode, and the controllers will keep track of that and manage that. Let's see here, yeah, I think that's probably the main issue there. We don't have the inertia that you would have in a rotating synchronous generator. So it is a challenge that engineers are very aware of these days and grappling with to find the best solution. So that's something that is happening on this project, giving PG&E more experience with that, and again, sort of control and monitoring and control of those sorts of things. And then finally, the protection relays. As I mentioned before, we have import and export limits that are really taken care of by the controllers, the microgrid controllers, but ultimately are enforced if the microgrid controller doesn't accommodate it, are enforced by the protection relays and basically the breakers that can isolate the generators if we exceed those limits. Next slide, please. So just very quickly, some key lessons learned. The replicable model, we think that CCAs are well suited to deploying microgrids in their communities, and in particular, these front-of-the-meter multi-customer microgrids. In terms of interconnection, kind of list out them here in terms of grid interactive mode, nothing really unique there in terms of interconnecting to the distribution utilities grid, but important to start early and understand that there may be potential upgrade costs, especially if it's a wholesale system, then you're going to be responsible for those as opposed to the net metered system. You might want to look for mitigations and ways to limit those costs and potentially be able to iterate in that sort of basically system impact study and facility study process. And then in island mode, the point is that there aren't currently sort of tariffs and operational roles and responsibilities and those sorts of agreements currently that exist for islanding a portion of the distribution systems grid with a third-party generator. And so we're working on developing those, and hopefully they will be useful to others that come after us. And then the CAISO market participation things I talked about as well. I think that's the last slide. I think that might be it. Well, actually, we have next steps. So we'll be right now working to complete the operational roles and responsibilities and tariff agreements and bilateral agreements with between PG&E and RCEA, and we're well along in that process and expect that to wrap up later this year. We're also waiting for final approval for the USDA loan. That's from their RUS program. That should be coming very soon. And then authority to construct from the Federal Aviation Administration, the FAA. If anybody out there is looking at doing a microgrid, I think I actually saw an early note about this, but at an airport, and I know that Santa Barbara, I think, is looking at this also. Just be forewarned that you might already know this, but working with the FAA will stretch things out in terms of the approval process. They're very there's a lot of regulation, a lot of approvals to go through, and for very good reason. But it's something that we're learning as we go, and it's definitely adds a whole new dimension to the project. There has been some slight delays. So for our construction and then commissioning the system, we were hoping to be up and running by about the end of this year or early next year. We still we plan to be under construction and fully constructed and commissioned starting the latter part of this year, the fall of this year, and then finishing up the first quarter of next year. So it's pushed us back maybe a couple of months, but not dramatically. We're hoping there won't be more delays there. In the meantime, we're continuing this other work, and there will be factory and laboratory testing of the microgrid controls and protection. This will be happening both at Schweitzer's labs in Pullman, Washington, as well as PG&E's lab, ATS lab in San Ramon. And certainly for front-of-the-meter microgrids, the utilities need to test out, the protection and the software and so forth in a laboratory setting to make sure that it meets the requirements that are necessary to ensure that their grid is safe and reliable and the way it operates. So, and then we'll be sharing more lessons learned. So thanks today for listening, and that's the end of the presentation, and I think we can take some questions now for the next 20 minutes.
Yes, thank you, Matthew and Jim, for the excellent presentation. We'll now open up the floor to questions. Questions can be typed in by clicking the Q&A button on your screen, and I'm seeing quite a few questions. I'm not sure that we'll be able to get to all of them, but we'll give it a try. Pretty straightforward question to start. How long can the grid island for?
Yeah, so and Matthew and I, we can just kind of, we'll do the little dance here of replying, but so the one unique aspect to this microgrid, perhaps unique anyway, is that the generation and storage asset has been sized very large compared to the load on the islanded portion of the grid. So those 20 accounts that will make up the microgrid when it's islanded have a peak load of about 330 kilowatts and an average load somewhere in the 200s kilowatts. So, and as you remember, the PV and battery is sized at 2.2 megawatts, and it's up to 2.5 with the net metered array. So it's way oversized. If you wouldn't size it that much just for those local loads, but it's sized for wholesale market participation and as a local renewable energy project for the CCA. The point I'll make is that it's the fact that it's oversized actually helps with the protection issues that we were talking about. There's a lot more fault current available. It also can help on a multi-customer microgrid. There are potentially some issues about what happens if there's load growth, what happens if new customers are added to the circuit, and now the system it loses its resilience, or it can't meet the same specifications it did when it was first built. By having a larger generation and storage, that's less of an issue. So to answer the question, we've done some analysis, and it looks to us like it probably, under most cases, will be able to operate just about indefinitely. In the worst of the winter, if the loads are high and the sun is very low, it may be a day or so, but if we lose the solar and battery, if there's not enough solar and battery, it will default to some existing diesel generators that are on automatic transfer switches. We're leaving those alone. But as soon as there's enough solar and storage, it will shut those down and shift back to the renewable. So they become a very deep backup. And in this case, for this system, the vast majority of the time, it will run on solar and storage.
Got it. Thank you. A next question. It's about the replicability and or scaling of the project of a microgrid of this sort in other CCA LSC service territories. Would others be able to do this without fundamental legislative and regulatory changes, i.e. PUC 218, interconnection processes, tariff making rules, etc.?
Yeah, I mean, so that's, I think, really one of the key goals for this project is to work out some of the kinks on those items. And, and that's where, as Jim mentioned, we're working with CAISO and it seems like the CPUC is very interested in this, and obviously working closely with PG&E to kind of figure out, like, okay, well, how is this going to work, and getting into kind of those nuances. Again, with everyone having the goal of this being something that isn't just a one-off kind of novelty, but something that, once those details are sorted out, you could do anywhere in kind of a more standardized approach. Although, obviously every project is going to be a little bit unique.
And I would just add to that we are in communication with the CPUC and the team there that is in charge of the open microgrid proceeding. We are going to be providing. We already did a workshop sometime 6 months or so ago. We are going to be providing lessons learned to the CPUC staff that may have some may inform that. Hopefully will inform the open proceeding and what the staff puts forward as proposals. We realize that there will be proposals from other stakeholders. That'll be interesting to see. We're not going to submit our own proposed, our own proposal. But I would just suggest that anybody who's interested in this stuff really pay attention to that proceeding, and that's the place where you can have input on, that's what that proceeding is aimed at doing, is making these types of things replicable.
Okay, and I'm going to combine two questions that I see here that are related to cost. What would have been a ballpark retail price of the system if grants and incentives are not available? And then part B, what kind of funding exists for local governments that they can take advantage of or leverage funds through a CCA to develop a microgrid for a critical facility like police stations and fire stations?
Yeah, so the total cost of the system is about $11 million. There's some of the costs that are associated with this being a pilot project. So there's a little bit more kind of R&D and some of these like tariff development activities that are part of that. And so there's pieces of it that I think make that a little bit larger number. But so ultimately we got the $5 million grant from the California Energy Commission, and then our CEA, our $6 or so million contribution is being financed by a USDA low interest rural electric utility loan. And so that's one thing that I think the USDA acknowledged us as an eligible rural utility, since we're rural and we sell electricity. And so other CCAs that serve rural customers could tap into that USDA low interest financing. Now, I'll say one thing that we didn't tap into is the fact that this is actually going to be an RCEA owned and operated system. So, the tax related incentives, is something that we can't access. And we ultimately decided not to try to bring in like a third party developer that could take advantage of that, just because there was enough partners and enough like cooks in the kitchen that we didn't want to try to layer that in. But so that $11-12 million price tag kind of doesn't take advantage of those kinds of incentives that a private developer that was brought in would be able to take advantage of. And and so for us, as far as leveraging CCA resources, I think again, we have our own objectives and and compliance requirements for renewables and storage. And so we really looked at the opportunity to say, well, okay, we already have our goals to build solar and storage. Can we pair that with these kinds of microgrid controls to get the resiliency benefits by co-locating the generation development with a critical facility? I think we're not asking the airport, and the airport's providing the land for the system, and obviously they're a close partner. But we didn't ask for them to kind of chip in on the costs of developing the system or pay ongoing fees, again, because this is a pilot. But certainly, I think there was a question about the value of resilience, and certainly a business can start to quantify that, or it's hard to put a price tag on the Coast Guard saving a fisherman and a public safety power shut-off event or something like that. I don't know how you could come up with a number, but it would be sort of a placeholder for the true community value. We didn't try to fully quantify like that resilience target, and partly because this facility is such a no-brainer for our community. I mean, it's like the airport and the Coast Guard. It's like we didn't have to do a lot of head scratching to see if it was worthwhile to have this level of resilience there. But I think when you're kind of comparing the cost of the system to maybe other types of facilities, there might be a little bit more of a balancing act of how much resilience you're willing to pay for, and wanting to get a better quantification of that.
I'll just add a little bit there to what Matthew said. As we are, so TRC is one of our project partners, and a small piece of what they're doing is some cybersecurity assessment, but they're also working on the evaluation of the business model and looking at market replication opportunities, and they'll be doing a bunch of stakeholder engagement and outreach around that as the project proceeds. And so we are looking right now at the business case for this pilot project. We're looking at the revenue streams. One of them we didn't mention is RA value. So that's something also that's in the mix. So we're going to be looking at the cost and the cost of the system without some of the added research and sort of CEC requirements is about, I think our most recent estimate was about 10.3 million. So a little below that, the 11 million that Matthew mentioned. So we're going to be looking at the actual costs and the actual revenues. And really what we're going to be doing is saying, okay, how much are we missing to make the business case work out without any resilience benefit? And really that is a way of saying how much is the cost of resilience? And then the question is, are people willing to pay that much for that resilience benefit? And as Matthew said, some of those benefits in terms of if we have a major earthquake and the Coast Guard and airport are the only way to get people and resources in and out of here and even get things around the county, and we're a very big rural county, that's, in my mind, that's sort of invaluable. So we will be looking at that, and we will be looking at what a lot of people, there's been some work done to estimate the value of resilience. We'll be taking that into account. And certainly when TRC goes from looking at the pilot case to looking at sort of replication and sort of broader application of this type of thing, we'll be looking some at what other people are trying to estimate resilience value. But again, we'll be calculating what the cost is for resilience, and in this case, then how we're valuing it for this project.
Great. And I'm glad you mentioned RA, because there were a few questions about that. A couple questions about the participants, in this case, the airport and the Coast Guard. Did it take a lot of effort to get them to buy in and participate? Or as retail customers, was there not much educating or buy-in necessary? And also, did you look at other locations and potential sites?
So yes, there was some look at other potential sites, and and again, this being a grant R&D project, there was some balancing act of like, well, okay, how complicated do we want it to be, or how simple do we want it to be, and what's sort of the right fit for what we're trying to demonstrate. But there was initial discussions about looking at, areas that have, hospital and medical facilities, and, and certainly we're interested in kind of the next step of looking at additional locations around the county where we could do this kind of project again. As far as convincing our partners, we're a joint powers agency that the county is a member of, and so their participation, I think, aligns with their goals for sustainability and resilience and emergency response capabilities. There's still logistics there as far as we're using a pretty large chunk, several acres of airport land, and basically our lease fee for that is the generation output from the net metered system. We didn't try to, again, quantify and charge them a price for the resilience, with this being a research project. And similarly, so for the Coast Guard, we're not asking them to pay for the resilience that this is adding, just due to the circumstances of this as a pilot. We got a letter of support from them, which I think is in true Department of Defense status, said, we do not object to this project with their letter of support. So we'll take that, that's fine. But I think as far as replication, there would be a question of like, well, okay, what if, we were going to recover some of the costs that are necessary to have the resilience elements of this, how would that be charged to customers? And then are all the customers on this branch of the grid willing to pay that? Maybe the Coast Guard and the airport say, sure, no problem, but there's also the county animal shelter, and there's like a gun club, and some private meters, and maybe they don't really have an interest or need for that resilience. And so that's where you might need to have another layer of controls to isolate the customers that need and want to pay for those benefits, if you're kind of looking at more of a business replication approach to this, as opposed to sort of a government-funded, targeted investment from a emergency response standpoint.
The one other way that I often look at this, and I think this is, again, part of this bigger conversation about cost and benefits and how things are allocated. But if communities are in this new world we live in, and it's even more bizarre here in the last month or two, but even just with climate change and stronger storms and fires and public safety power shutoffs and just this whole, where things seem to be headed, having that resilience and that security, locally with some energy resources. If there are particular facilities, maybe they're hospitals, maybe they're airports or emergency shelters and those sorts of things. Granted, there may be some revenue benefit. Certainly there is to keeping the airport open, and keeping it running. But on top of that is this huge resiliency benefit. And I think that if communities say, hey, it's really important to us to have this resilience and to have this added safety for our community, and it doesn't really necessarily have to fall on the hospital or the airport to pay for all that resilience. The community can say, we want that resilience. We're willing to pay a very small amount on our electric bill. And in this case, it could be done through their CCA bill to pay for, some added cost and just distribute it across all the ratepayers rather than individual customers having to pay for that added resilience. If in fact they're providing a service that is critical and benefits the community at large. And it's just one perspective, but.
Okay, I'm going to ask one more question, and my apologies that we don't have more time. But I think we'll be posting lots of information about this project, and by all means reach out to our panelists, and I'm sure they'll be happy to provide more information. I'm again going to combine several questions to say that there's a tremendous interest in documents and roadmaps and anything that you can do to help these CCAs and others who are interested in doing a microgrid in their communities. Is there a plan for some kind of clearinghouse, or how do you plan to provide the documents and make them public?
So we do have, this is a CEC funded project. So we have a technology and knowledge transfer plan that is laid out for one of our tasks with the CEC. As I said, we are participating in the open proceeding with the CPUC. We did do one workshop. We probably will do another webinar or workshop, something to that effect. Same thing with the CAISO, we're part of that hybrid resource initiative. Certainly the documents that, we're not going to be able to share confidential information, which might be some details of contracts or some details of cybersecurity, those things. Obviously, there is a cyber security assessment, a cyber plan, a non-confidential plan that will be made available. So that will help others with cybersecurity assessment and those things. But yeah, we will try to make as much of that information available. It'll be available through our CEC reporting. And I would think that RCA, as a CCA and trying to help move this stuff forward, some of those documents could just be made available through a website. We have not done that yet, but that makes sense, and we're open to kind of exploring that a little bit more and getting input from the stakeholders.
Great. Well, thank you, Matthew and Jim. We'll have to have you back possibly for another update on the microgrid project. I know there's a lot of interest. A recording of this webinar will be posted on the CalCCA website at cal-cca.org on the webinars page, where you can also find information about upcoming community energy innovation webinars. Next month's webinar will take place on May 29th and focus on how California communities are driving investment in EV charging infrastructure, with presenters from East Bay Community Energy and the Governor's Office of Business and Economic Development. We appreciate you spending your time with us today. If you would like additional information or have follow-up questions, you can reach me through the email address on the screen. Stay well, everyone.